Hi everyone, this is Mark Lux, Extension Weed Scientist with Ohio State University with the second part of my talk here at the CTIC. This half hour I'm going to be talking about superweeds, give you a little bit of perspective on the biology of these and the resistance and why they're an issue and kind of how we got here. This came out of a seminar that I gave to the Horticulture and Crop Science Department last fall, so this is a sort of encapsulates some of that. I think I've given a lot of presentations over the years that have covered these weeds, and I think a lot of you probably know this either through what I've talked about or your own experience with these particular weeds. In our group, we talk about the big five, which really drive herbicide programs. We can have 20 to 30 different weeds or even more in a no-till situation that could infest a crop field, but these are really the weeds that are most problematic, not necessarily easy to control, develop resistance, and really drive herbicide programs to a large extent. Horseweed or mare's tail, it's called Canada fleabane in Canada. Giant ragweed, common ragweed, and then the amaranths, water hemp, and Palmer amaranth. We have not a lot of Palmer amaranth in the state, but the rest of these are pretty common and pretty abundant. I think most of you probably know what these look like. Here's mare's tail. Palmer amaranth, which probably a fair number of you haven't seen except from photos, which is a good thing. Of all these weeds, it's probably arguably the most problematic weed that took over the South from about 2000, starting in 2005, and they've been battling ever since. We have a lot more water hemp, which is slightly less problematic, not quite as aggressive, but has a lot of the same characteristics. And in terms of developing resistance to herbicides, probably is even more problematic. And then the ragweeds, giant ragweed, which if we're not the epicenter of giant ragweed in Ohio, then I'm not sure where it is. It's probably as common here as it is anywhere. And in spite of the fact it doesn't produce a lot of seed, it's still here. And then common ragweed, which is interesting because a lot of people don't have common ragweed left or much of it, including us at our research farm. Whereas we have a lot of giant ragweed still there. And we have pockets of this, like the northwest part of Ohio. There's a fair number of multiple resistant herbicide common ragweed populations. And then a lot of other people just really don't see common ragweed much. Also, far northeastern Ohio has some issues with it. So I think this one really depends on where you are. But for those people who have where it's development of multiple resistance, it's certainly an issue. And these are the weeds that show up most in the surveys that we do and that our county educators do. So this is our results of our survey in 2020. We did about 5,000 fields across 47 counties. And because of adoption of new technology, actually the numbers are looking better than they have. We typically have about 55% of the fields weed free, and we were up to 74% this year. And our giant ragweed and mare's tail numbers were cut about in half. They typically have run more like 15 to 25, and in some cases, mare's tail's been up to 40%. You can see they're at 13 and 10 here. And then you've got water hemp, which is the weed that's actually increasing. We had 8%. We don't separate water hemp from pigweed, but we have 8% statewide, or in the soybean areas that we survey, but up to 31% in west central Ohio, which is largely water hemp, and then common ragweed, which was down as well. Our county educators, we typically have 20 to 25 or something like that that'll do this for us. And this year we had 26. They covered about 2,600 fields. They pick a stretch of road and do 100 fields or so, and so they can, because our transects cover a whole county. Their survey I think can be a little bit biased by picking a stretch of road, not intentionally, that just has some weedier fields on it. So you can see they were at 41% weed free, but that's up from 29% the previous year. And their numbers are all higher, but still they're lower than they have been in the past, with the exception of water hemp. And you can see water hemp statewide was about where they had it last year, but up to 14 to 24% in the western part of the state. So these are the weeds that we know we're going to have every year, and they're just for a number of reasons they're most problematic. Water hemp is spreading. It typically it has started in far western Ohio and in northwestern, and now you can find it really almost anywhere. The states where we have white here in the middle of that red, just we didn't have a county educator there to respond to us when I sent a request for information. So it's basically spreading. Whereas Palmer amaranth, we know we're not really getting much spread within the state. We're getting a series of still new infestations or possibility for new infestations from external sources. And so we have had a few counties where an infestation has started or it's gotten a little bit of a foothold. This does not mean that that whole county has Palmer, the ones in red here. It just means that there's a field, and typically it's only one or two fields where it got to the point where it had to be managed and they had to drive the population back down. And then the gray counties are places where it showed up, but then it was eradicated. The interesting thing about Palmer, because it's not really moving around the state, it's external introductions from external sources, is for some of these, we know pretty well how it started. And, as where water hemp is moving around the state with any way that weed seed moves, this is still typically coming in on infested equipment or moving from field to field on, for example, custom combines or even the combine with one farm operation, cotton feed products and hay from other parts of the United States. And then there has been some examples of crep seed that's had some, or that type of seed, cover seed that's had some contaminant because that seed's grown in areas where Palmer amaranth can be endemic. So one of the ways to look at this is we don't really have we only have tough weeds left. So, as I said, we can have a lot of weeds in a field and you probably still can find lamb's quarter and smartweed. There's still seed in those fields, but the aggressive herbicide programs we're using now and the improvement in our herbicide programs since I first started this job in 1987 means, as long as you're doing a relatively broad spectrum program with a couple applications, you're typically taking care of the rest of those weeds. And so you've got these tough weeds left that are really driving herbicide programs and keep adapting to be problematic even as we develop new technology and their ability to escape with late emergence or to develop resistance or whatever. So we've been selecting for these weeds really over a long period of time. We've been selecting for these really ever since we started doing weed control. But if you go back to the 1980s, we had more tillage and not as many herbicides. So we just typically had more weeds, period. And we had weeds like cocklebur, velvet leaf, and lamb's quarter, and weeds like that were an issue. And then as we've actually created a more challenging situation for weed control over time with large acreage, early planting, things like that, conservation tillage. And at the same time, we've had more and more effective herbicide programs that are just giving us better control of most of our weeds. And then we have these few weed problems left. The big five, as we call them here, that are still here and they're still adapting to whatever we're doing and are still present. So we have selected for weed problems that are extremely competitive and well adapted to our production and tillage system. So whatever we do, they're basically still adapting to that. And one of the questions I get at meetings sometimes is, what's the next weed going to be? And I usually think, well, I think these weeds are tough enough and they're not really going anywhere. They will readily develop resistance to multiple herbicide groups or sites of action. And just a combination of their biology and that resistance means they require complex management systems. So one of the things that happens when we get a new tool, for example, that's really effective and we oversimplify systems, that causes problems because the weed really readily adapts to that. So there's no easy fixes for these weeds. We need all the technology we can get. We need comprehensive programs, diversity, and herbicide use. And we really need to focus more over time on preventing soil seed bank increases for these weeds. Their characteristics are not just that they're able to develop resistance to multiple sites of action. One of the reasons they can do that is because these are weeds that we have to implement control for multiple times over the year or through the season, right? Compared to some other weeds like velvet leaf, for example, maybe just one pre-herbicide or one post-herbicide gets it. You've got, multiple pre-herbicides and multiple post applications for some of these weeds, but they tend to have a really extended period of emergence. In some cases like mare's tail, it's essentially all year. They're very well adapted to our current tillage systems. They do well with germination at the surface. Some of them, like giant ragweed, do well with deep emergence. They tend to they're either cross-pollinated, all of these to a large extent, or they're dioecious, which means they have different male and female plants. And so they have a lot of innate diversity, and I think that helps with the development of resistance and the spontaneous development of mutations that confer resistance. Prolific seed production in some cases, rapid growth, and then some tolerance of herbicides at bigger stages, and they're extremely competitive. You look at giant ragweed, Palmer amaranth, water hemp, for example, and a dense stand of mare's tail. they're very competitive with the crops. So, these are just weeds that have a variety of things going for them, which gives them that adaptability. Mare's tail produces a couple 100,000 seeds. They blow around. They can germinate right on the soil surface. They basically don't need any coverage to do that. If you bury them more than, an inch, centimeter deep, they get them down to an inch or something like that. Really, they really can't germinate and establish, but their ability to blow around and land somewhere means that you find mare's tail essentially everywhere. I can go a mile from my house on the west side of Columbus, along the river, the Souder River, any number of places, parks, and I can find mare's tail anywhere. Um, really anywhere that I go. These emergence patterns, you could show the same thing for water hemp or palmer amaranth, except here theirs would start probably in early May and go even later than you show here. But this is a giant ragweed emergence curve, an actual one from 2006 where we measured it at South Charleston. I mean, it starts late March and it goes all the way through early July. So you look at the number of times you have to implement control for a weed like that, and it doesn't lend itself to simple herbicide programs, and it lends itself to development of resistance because of multiple applications and very competitive. Giant ragweed is as competitive as anything with both corn or beans, especially if it gets to start with the crop or shortly after it. Palmer amaranth is really, I think, put the term superweeds on the map, and was the reason the Weed Science Society of America, the WSSA, finally had to come up and basically publicly say, okay, we accept that the definition of superweed exists. And I mean, that use of that term in the media wasn't going to go away, and then we had to deal with this. But I mean, Palmer amaranth is essentially a weapon of mass destruction when you put together its growth rate, its seed production, and things like that. The definition that the Weed Science Society of America came up with was that a superweed is slang used to describe a weed that has evolved characteristics that make it more difficult to manage due to repeated use of the same management tactic. Overdependence on a single tactic as opposed to using diverse approaches can lead to such adaptations. So Palmer amaranth's an example. Dandelion is an example of a weed. I think that's a super weed that really any one tactic you use doesn't get it. What's interesting about this is the WSSA didn't say that superweed is a weed that has evolved characteristics. It basically says this is slang used to describe a weed. So we're not accepting that. Weed scientists actually kind of think the term superweed is a stupid definition, I think, but we're accepting that this is slang that gets used to describe some of the problem weeds. And it's typically affiliated with those weeds that have evolved. In the media, it's associated with those weeds that have evolved into problems since the use of GMO crops started, really. That's the twist that's put on it. Some of these, like Palmer amaranth, have sort of reset our clock. Water hemp's in this category as well. We've really got used to spraying pretty big weeds, and especially given that our pre-emergent herbicides take out a lot of weeds, and we're coming back in our case just for mare's tail or giant ragweed. And giant ragweed, you can actually get relatively big, and you almost have to based on its growth rate. But coming back to water hemp and Palmer amaranth, which your window is 2 to 4 inches, and once you get past that, you really start to lose control. So it sort of resets our expectations and our expertise in terms of what we have to do to get control. The seed production for some of these is really the big thing, and the Palmer and water hemp are at the top here with over 1 million seeds per plant in some cases, which, the potential for the explosion of a population over several years with that type of seed production is really immense. You can see some of the other common weeds we deal with here. Mare's tail at a couple 100,000, common ragweed at 62. Giant ragweed actually doesn't produce a lot of seed. So it's amazing to me sometimes that it actually perpetuates itself as well as it does, especially when you look at the far right and the Achilles heel. These are species that are geared towards increasing their population as fast as they can because they don't have a very long seed viability in the soil. So if you look at the seed longevity there, you can see it's usually for mare's tail and Palmer and water hemp, you're down to about 5% or less viability, or even less over the course of 3 to 4 years after it ends up in the soil. Giant ragweed, the same thing. Some of these other weeds can last considerably longer. This depends on whether they're buried or not, of course. Seed production of a weed like Palmer amaranth, when you look at some of these seed heads, like the one that's being held there on the right, I mean, that is a dense mass of seed on that bristly seed head. There's probably 100,000 or a couple 100,000 on that on that one appendage alone. And of course, it gives the amaranths, and to some extent, mare's tail as well, because mare's tail is no slug when it comes to producing seed, this ability to really increase their populations over time. They don't have a lot of longevity in soil, so their strategy is, okay, we're going to do this. And then, if you're actually very aggressive at controlling them and minimize seed return to the soil, you can drive the population back fairly fast. But, so we have these, and there have been multiple of these that I've been involved with, and also people have told me, wow, water hemp is just blowing up all over the place. And that's because, the year before you see something like this, you just had enough plants going to seed, producing 500,000 to a million seeds per plant, and they're just really taking off. And again, the Achilles heel is that we lose 80% of our viability for a lot of these over the course of the first year in the winter, first year over winter. And then in this case, it was down to 5%. There was a study in Illinois that showed after 4 years of complete control with a big seeding at the beginning of that the water hemp was down to 0.3% viability. So definitely this is the thing that keeps them manageable at all. And tillage has some influence in this. This is showing that the year after, when you till, the emergence that you get the next year based on the type of tillage, where you have a fair amount of water hemp or Palmer amaranth, and you can see you get the most emergence in no-till, and then minimum or conventional, where you can bury some of it, reduces it some, and then deep tillage puts it pretty deep so it doesn't come up from that depth very well. But you can see even with the minimum and conventional till, which would be chisel or a seedbed prep in the spring, you can see it really doing pretty well there. And these are weeds on top of all that just are prone to developing resistance. I think not just because you spray them multiple times, just because they inherently have more variability in the ability to mutate. So this is showing the number of herbicide-resistant species for the top 10 weed fields, so the weed families, so the 10 that are most prone to developing resistance. And so that second bar with the 44 is Asteraceae, and that's where giant and common ragweed are, and also mare's tail in that family. And then you go down over to the 11, that's the Amaranthus, and it shows 11 species. Well, there aren't hardly any more than 11 species that we deal with in agriculture, so almost all of them develop herbicide resistance, right? And then their tendency of those is also to develop multiple resistance. So this shows a number of sites of action they're resistant to, essentially across the world, I think. And this doesn't mean that these are all multiple resistant, but once you have resistance to one, you can have resistance to other develop. So you can see fourth one down is Amaranthus palmeri, that's Palmer amaranth, and you go on down to Tuberculatus, or Amanthus rudis, which has 7, and then you see Caniza, 2 Caniza species down there. That's a horseweed and a relative to Caniza in another part of the world, and then Ambrosia artemisifolia down there, which is common ragweed. The only reason giant ragweed isn't on this list is because hardly anything controls giant ragweed really post very well, so it's hard to find something that I think controls it effectively enough to select for resistance. So we have lots of populations of giant ragweed. A lot of them are ALS resistant in the state. We have 2 different types of resistance. We have some where it kind of turns yellow and hunkers down. You get 50 to 70% suppression and comes back. And then we have this strange rapid necrosis response where about a day or 2 after you spray glyphosate, it burns the leaves, which is really atypical for glyphosate. It just doesn't do that, as most of you know. And then those are plants that look like they're dead, but they come back even faster and do better than the one on the left. We have multiple resistance of mare's tail we've dealt with in the state since 2003 or so, and it basically makes our burn down situations more problematic, and it takes away all of our post-emergence options in Roundup Ready and non-GMO soybeans. Just a tough weed. Water hemp has now evolved resistance to herbicides from 7 site of action families, and multiple resistance is a norm. And multiple resistance for water hemp can be anywhere from 2 to 7-way resistance. And so it's the bottom line in water hemp is anything that we use repeatedly for water hemp, it's developed resistance to. You can see the ALS inhibitors at the top. There are populations that are resistant to 2,4-D and dicamba, photosystem 2 inhibitors, atrazine, metribuzin, glyphosate, PPO inhibitors. At the bottom, the HPPD inhibitors and mesotrione, asoxaflutol, etc. And then the newer one, and this is kind of atypical for us in resistance, we most often develop resistance, I think, because we're spraying foliar herbicides and selecting for resistance, and in this case, the water hemp has developed resistance to group 15 herbicides, metolachlor, pyroxasulfone, which are not foliar applied herbicides, they're residual herbicides. And the fact that we're using these both pre and in post programs to get residual control is putting a lot of selection pressure on the water hemp. And water hemp has also developed multiple mechanisms that confer a single mechanism can confer resistance to multiple sites of action, which is not happening really in the giant ragweed and the mare's tail and the common ragweed. So, for example, for glyphosate here and PPO inhibitors, you can have a mutation for each, so you have to have different mutations that code for resistance. But there are mutations occurring that confer for resistance to photosystem 2 inhibitors and HPPD inhibitors and 2,4-D, for example, and it's a mutation that codes for enhanced degradation of herbicides, and that crosses over herbicide groups. Just an example of the resistance to acetamides, the group 15 herbicides. This is some work the University of Illinois did some preliminary work, and so you can see the non-treated and the S-metolachlor essentially looking the same there on the left, and it does confer resistance across the board to the other herbicides with some variability, I think, depending on which herbicide it is, but their assumption and their later research showed that once you have resistance to metolachlor, it does cross over to the other ones. And so the bottom line here really is that these are weeds that just are tough, and we've reached this point now where I think we really all thought, including weed scientists, that for a number of these weeds we could keep coming up with different herbicide options and new herbicide options and manage them. And to some extent we have, but at the same time that we've been doing that, the weeds are still here, and they have continued to develop resistance to the new herbicides that we throw at them. And so at this point, especially I think for palmer amaranth and water hemp, there's a recognition that we have to do some different things, that we're just keep worrying about our chemicals, and in the end, it just won't work. And so it's interesting. There's a lot of interest in cover crops, and weed scientists have been doing a fair amount of research recently on cover crops, showing how we can integrate these with herbicides and the benefit we get to try to take some of that selection pressure off. And then the other thing, of course, is really focusing on seed bank to try to prevent issues like this, because the weeds that we have coming up late, if you can catch those when you still have a few weeds out there, those are weeds that are likely resistant to whatever you used. And if we don't let those weeds go to seed, that's one way to prevent resistance from occurring. So we're definitely going to need some new technology to try to help us with this. It speeds this up and makes it economical, but it's a little bit difficult to see if we don't change our tactics somewhat and really start to focus on seed and these late season plants and seed return to the soil, how we can beat weeds that are really this effective. They're not going anywhere soon.